Welcome to the Balance Nest podcast. I'm Anna Marie, mama, energy worker, human design nerd, and firm believer that most of what's happening in your family is connected to what's happening underneath the surface. So grab your coffee and let's dig in. Why does everything need a label? The science of diagnosing the normal human experience. So we've all been in those situations where you're talking to another mom and within 5 minutes, she has named 3 separate diagnoses for herself and 2 for her kid. And I'm not judging. There's something in us that is deeply relieved when we can name what's happening. Like, oh, okay, it has a name. I'm not just falling apart. There's a word for this. But this is the question on my mind. What happens when the name becomes the thing? When the label stops being a tool and starts being the whole story? And that's what I want to get into today. Why our brains are literally wired to categorize and label, and what the research actually says about what we've done to the normal human emotional experience, and where the line is between a framework that helps you understand yourself and one that is that picking up and one that quietly keeps you stuck, because there is a line. And I think a lot of us are on the wrong side of it without realizing it. So let's start with the actual neuroscience of this, because I think it's important to understand why we do it before we talk about it. Your brain did not evolve to understand. It evolved to predict. When your brain encounters something new, some sensation, some emotion, some situation that it hasn't seen before, the first thing it does is go looking in its file system, right, for something similar. It wants to match the pattern. It wants to slot the new thing into a category that already exists. And it does this so that it can stop spending energy on it and move on. So researchers at Ohio State found that figuring out whether a pattern exists actually activates the reward center in the brain. So every time you go, oh, that's my anxious attachment style, or oh, that's just my luteal phase, there's a weird neurological reward happening. And your brain is literally celebrating because it filed it away properly. So this tells you why we're so addicted to these frameworks: human design, attachment theory, nervous system language, cycle awareness. They all feel so good because they're completing patterns that your brain has been trying to solve. And that relief is real. And I'm not dismissing it. There's genuine value in having language for your experience. But this is where it starts to get complicated. The brain's job is to be efficient, not accurate. Again, it wants to be efficient, not accurate. It wants to file things away quickly so it can move on. And when we hand it a label, a diagnosis, a type, a pattern, it files the whole experience under that word. And then it stops looking. The inquiry ends. The curiosity goes quiet. And that's where the tool stops being a tool. And I actually have a personal example of this that I think captures exactly what I mean. A couple of years ago, I went to the Amen Clinic to get brain scans done. I have had multiple concussions in the past, and I wanted to know if symptoms I was experiencing were residual from past concussions or ADHD, or if it was a combination of both. I wanted to know what was causing what. Hence the extreme swing to go get full brain scans done. And I want to be very clear about why I did it. I didn't go looking for a label or a diagnosis. I wasn't looking for a prescription. I went because I wanted information I could actually use. Like, is this something that I can actively work on and shift? Is this something that needs lifelong adjustments? Is it both? I wanted to know so that I could figure out the right way to move forward and use the information as a tool, not a crutch. And I think that's the distinction that gets lost so often in how we talk about diagnoses. The question isn't whether to seek understanding, it's what you do with it once you have it. So I want to zoom out, and I think this context will matter. The labeling everything culture that we're living in didn't come from nowhere. There's a whole history in psychiatry and medicine that brought us to this moment. And some of it genuinely helped people, and some of it has done real damage. And for a long time, mental health struggles were invisible and stigmatized. Like, I'm not going to downplay that. That is a real issue. People suffered in silence. Naming those experiences like depression, anxiety, and trauma gave language for what they were going through. It reduced shame. It opened so many doors for support. And that is a huge deal. I don't want to gloss over that. But there's also been this other thing happening where the clinical definitions kept expanding and where the bar for what counts as a disorder kept lowering, where normal, predictable human emotional responses started getting classified as pathology. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, fancy psychiatrist book to diagnose mental health conditions, there is a bereavement section in there. And up until 2013, if you were grieving the death of someone you loved and experiencing sadness, sleeplessness, difficulty concentrating, that was considered a normal grief response, and it would not be diagnosed as depression. So it got removed. And if your symptoms continue for more than 2 weeks after losing someone, it can qualify as major depressive disorder. 2 weeks. So humans have been grieving since we were in caves. We have rituals and traditions across every single culture on Earth for moving through loss. And now, if it goes past 2 weeks, that's potentially a disorder. I'm not saying clinical depression isn't real, and I assume that part of this was so that people could get help for longer periods of time, but I am saying that the edges are getting blurry. And when that happens, everything starts to look like a diagnosis. And it's a self-perpetuating cycle. We label more, which makes more things look like disorders, which creates more labeling. And that's the water we're all swimming in right now. And it goes beyond just the mental space and the mental disorder space and the emotional space. I see this in the parenting space too. And especially, especially with gentle parenting. I think gentle parenting started as something genuinely helpful. Let's attune to our kids. Let's understand nervous system regulation. Let's stop shaming big feelings. All of that is freaking fantastic and necessary. But somewhere it tipped into being where every big emotion is a protocol and every meltdown is a diagnosis and every bit of normal kid behavior has a framework attached to it. And instead of being more present with our kids, we're more in our heads about them. And I've watched this play out in real life up close. And this couple, they were too deep into gentle parenting. And I get that they were coming from a genuine love for their kids, but it got to a point where they didn't want to use the word no at all. They just wanted to redirect, always redirect. And I remember thinking, now mind you, I was probably like 20, early 20s watching this play out. So definitely didn't have kids of my own. And I remember thinking, no is such an important word. And what is it? The Olsen twins were like, no is a complete sentence on its own. No. It is such an important word to teach to your kids and for them to understand that no means having boundaries, and boundaries are crucial. I think there's a Modern Family episode about it too. And when kids never hear it, they don't learn that the world has those edges, that the world has those boundaries. But what struck me most was watching them stop trusting themselves entirely as humans, as parents, not listening to their gut instincts at all, or using their life experiences to raise their kids, using their own knowledge. And that part, I think, is heartbreaking, that they felt so diminished in their own knowledge that they felt like they couldn't trust themselves at all if it wasn't backed up by a book. And in my head, I kept thinking that book was written by one person, one human being who also makes mistakes, who also has blind spots, who also figured things out as they went. And getting insight from books is fantastic. I'm not against getting information in any way, shape, or form. I'm against taking one piece of information as gospel. But letting a book raise your kids without your own input in the mix, without your own gut, without your own instincts, without your own lived experiences at the table, that was wild. And I can tell you that it didn't go the way they had hoped. Now I want to talk about what actually happens when a label becomes an identity. There is a difference between saying I have anxiety and saying I am an anxious person or I'm feeling anxious. There's a difference between saying I've been moving through some depression lately and I'm depressed. It sounds subtle, but the neurology of it is not subtle at all. Temporary states going into enduring identities. That's what's happening here. And it happens neurologically when you make that shift. In psychology, there are these things called schemas, mental templates your brain builds from repeated experiences. And they're basically your brain's operating system for interpreting the world. And when you internalize a label, when it moves from this is something I'm experiencing to this is who I am, it merges with those schemas. It becomes part of the filter that everything runs through. And once that happens, your brain starts looking for evidence to confirm it. So, I mean, if you say you want a purple car, you're going to magically start seeing more purple cars because your brain is searching for those purple cars. So when they pop up, you're like, oh, I found one. Oh, I found one. There's so many more purple cars. But it's not that there's more purple cars. It's that your brain is actively searching for it. So it's the same thing here. Your brain is actively searching for the evidence to confirm I am depressed. So you tell yourself, I'm an anxious person, and suddenly your brain is finding anxiety everywhere, right? Because that is its job now. It's running the anxious person program, and then you wonder why things aren't shifting, aren't getting better. There's also a term in psychology for what happens when this goes all the way, identity engulfment, where the diagnosis doesn't just describe an experience you're having, it becomes the primary lens through which you understand yourself and present to the world. Because they believe they'll have a symptom forever, they ultimately do. And this applies to every framework. I'm not saying what I teach is excluded here. This applies to human design. And when we use type as a permission slip to not stretch our boundaries, that's the same thing. It applies to cycle awareness when we use our luteal phase as a reason to never be available. It applies to nervous system work when I'm dysregulated becomes an identity instead of an observation. Any map can become a cage if you stop treating it like a map. So we don't want stagnation. There's no stagnation to these dynamic entities. That's what I keep coming back to. Your experience is not static. Your nervous system is not a fixed thing. The energy is always moving unless we stop it in place with a story about who we permanently are. I want to say that again. The energy is always moving unless we stop it in place with a story about who we permanently are. So let's talk about when labels actually help. I want to pause here because I don't want this to sound like I'm telling you to throw out every tool and every system and every piece of knowledge you've gathered about yourself and your kids, because that's not what I'm saying at all. I use this stuff. I teach this stuff. Human design literally changed my life in very real and specific ways. Cycle awareness completely rewired how I show up as a parent. Nervous system language gave me vocabulary for things I'd been experiencing my whole life without understanding. So the question isn't whether to use frameworks, the question is how you're holding them. And there's solid neuroscience behind why naming your experience helps. It's called affect labeling. What the research shows is that when you put a feeling into words, activity in the amygdala decreases. And the amygdala is your brain's like alarm system. And at the same time, your prefrontal cortex becomes more active. And that's the part with reasoning and regulation. So naming creates a shift from reactionary to reflective, which is fantastic. That's the name it to tame it thing that Dan Siegel talks about, and it is backed by brain imaging research. Also, I love Dan Siegel. Buy all his books. But here's what the research also found that I think is really important. Minimal labeling works better than exhaustive labeling. You don't need to run the full diagnosis every time you have a feeling. Noticing and briefly naming it is enough. And the more you analyze and categorize and layer on frameworks, the less regulatory benefits you actually get. So in this case, less is more. Naming a feeling in real time is very powerful. Turning a feeling into a permanent identity, that's where it flips. And for some people, a formal diagnosis is genuinely relief. If you've spent years wondering why your brain works the way it does, and then you get an ADHD or autism diagnosis, that can be the thing that finally makes sense of everything. It can reduce the shame. It can open access to support that you couldn't get before. I'm not arguing against that. For real disorders, the ones that don't correct themselves, the ones that cause significant functional impairment, diagnosis serves an important purpose. The distinction is, does this label open a door or close one? Does it give you a starting point for understanding yourself? Or does it become the final word on what you're capable of? A map or a verdict? That's the question here. And I'll use myself as an example, because I think it's relevant. My diagnosis from the Amen Clinic, the ADHD piece, was genuinely useful. It gave me things I could actually work with. It helped me understand why my obsession with calendars and being on time wasn't just a personality quirk. It was because those things don't come naturally to my brain, and I had to build systems around them. It helped me understand that what I eat and drink affects me more than it might affect someone else. And that's just worth knowing. It's helpful. It opened a door to how other people navigate similar struggles. And some of that was really helpful. So I'm not sitting here telling you that a diagnosis is useless. That's not my experience at all, but it was never an excuse. Not once did I sit down and go, well, I have ADHD, so that's just how it is. I mean, if anything, I think all my squirrels are a superpower. And I've spent years building a life that works with how my brain operates instead of fighting it. And that's what a diagnosis can do when you hold it right. It's information, it's a starting point. And it's definitely not this brag-lated. So this is where my own work comes in, and I want to be clear about something first. When I work with clients, I'm not running one protocol. I do emotion code, biodynamic craniosacral therapy, polarity therapy, energetic pendulation therapy. I tie somatic work into everything. And honestly, I don't decide what I'm going to do with someone until I'm actually with the person and reading what their system needs in that moment. And that's because no two people are the same. No two people are carrying the same thing, and no two sessions are going to look the same. The modality follows the person, not the other way around. And I think that's actually really relevant to what we've been talking about today, because all of these approaches share something in common. None of them work by slapping a label on what's happening and calling it done. They all operate from the same underlying truth, that the body knows something. The energy is trying to move somewhere, and the job is to create enough space and enough safety for it to complete what it started. This is what I've observed in my own body and in years of client work across all these modalities. The moment we rush to categorize an experience, we interrupt that movement. We freeze it. We take something that was trying to complete and we put it in a box with a name on it. And then we're surprised when it's still in a box a year later. A diagnosis by nature is very static. It says, this is what you are. The work I do operates from, this is where you are right now, and it will shift. Those are fundamentally different orientations. One is a verdict and one is a doorway. And this isn't just the energy world talking. The nervous system literature supports this too. Somatic approaches across the board are built on the same premise, that the body knows how to complete what it started. What gets in the way is almost always the story that we layer on top. The nervous system doesn't heal by being categorized. It heals by being witnessed, by having enough space and enough safety to finish what it started. So practically, what does that look like in real life? It looks like sitting with something before you name it, asking what you're actually sensing in your body before you ask what disorder might explain it. Saying, something is moving through me right now, instead of, I am this thing that has this problem. And it looks like trusting that the movement itself is the healing, not the label you give it on the way through. All right. So I don't want to just leave you with concepts. So here's some actual things you can do this week with what we've talked about today. The first one is to audit your language. Just for a few days, just notice when you say, I am versus I feel, or I'm experiencing. And notice when you describe yourself as a permanent thing versus a person moving through something. You don't have to change anything yet. We're just noticing. Awareness is the first step, always. The second thing is to pause before you reach for the framework. Next time you or your kid has a big emotional experience, just sit with it for a moment before you label it, before you're like, oh, I'm super grumpy today. I'm in my luteal phase. Okay, just sit with those feelings. Oh gosh, I feel heavy today. I feel prickly. I feel, what does overwhelm feel like? I feel cloudy. This is all legit, by the way. So right, just in that amount of time, I could feel a big chunk of weight come off of me from being in this phase of my period cycle. It's not hard. We're so stuck in these things that we forget that our bodies are talking to us 24/7. So simply giving it 30 seconds to talk to you is a big deal these days. So again, ask what you're actually sensing right now. Where is it living in my body? What does it want to do? You might still name it after that. That's fine. But let the experience be real before it becomes categorized. And let's see, third piece of homework, hold on to all your frameworks loosely. It's that there's no ride or die here. Whatever maps you're working with right now, human design, nervous system language, attachment theory, your cycle, keep asking whether they're opening something or closing something. A map is only useful when it helps you navigate. It stops being useful the moment it replaces your direct experience with a theory about that direct experience. And got one more. Let some things just move through without giving them a name. Not everything needs to be identified and processed and understood. Sometimes something just needs to be felt fully without resistance, and then it can complete. And you don't even know what to call it because you were too busy being in it. And this is what healing actually looks like. I'm not saying to throw everything out. I'm not saying diagnoses aren't real or that the language we've developed for understanding mental and emotional experiences is useless. I use it, I live it, I teach it. What I'm saying is there's a difference between a map and a cage. And sometimes we don't notice when we've moved from one to the other. So when the label stops helping you understand yourself and starts keeping you from yourself, when the diagnosis becomes the story instead of the tool inside the story, that's when it's worth setting it down. Your experience doesn't need a diagnosis to be real. It just needs you to be with it long enough to let it move. So if this episode made you curious about doing this work in a community of people who actually speak this language, I have a school community where we can dive deeper into all of this. Comment, connect below, and I'll send you the link, or you can find it in all of my links wherever they are. As always, your family is worth the work. I'll see you in the next one.